Okay, we're in Caesarea. Not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but I'm with my longtime friend Levi Lauer. I knew him at the University of Missouri when he was the Hillel director there in the early 70s. And at that time I knew him as Larry Lauer. And he's had an extraordinary career here in Israel for many years, and I'm sure that his fan club will be interested in this video. So I wanted to ask you, Levi, if you would tell us a little bit about your background, how you ended up coming to Israel, and a little bit about the work that you've done here, please.
I grew up in a home in Cleveland, Ohio, which is a good place to be from. You know, they say about Cleveland, Ohio, that it's so boring that dying there is redundant, but it was a good place. It was a good place to grow up in a home that was deeply committed Jewishly, profoundly Jewishly undereducated, and Zionistically devoted. My parents insisted that I go to Hebrew school every day instead of practicing to be a second baseman for the Cleveland Indians, which at the time was deeply annoying and today I'm grateful for. We made the move to Israel in 1976, both out of a discontent with American society and its Vietnam politics, in response to what I perceived to be an existential threat to the state of Israel as a result of the '73 war. And because when we were married, it was one of three things that we committed to trying to do. We met on the boat on the way to Israel, and that seemed like a natural extension of that experience. We came to Israel because I wanted to live at the heart of Jewish experience and not at its margins. I wanted to have the experience of the glories of the best of Jewish successes morally and politically, and accept responsibility for the worst of our failures. I think that life is best lived with that heavy responsibility sitting on you. The attempt to escape that responsibility, which I think is the state of the overwhelming majority of diaspora Jewry, I think is an alienation from the heart of what Jewish identity might produce for you. And having said that, given the current distress that we're facing, it's difficult to keep in balance what our appreciable successes have been morally, societally, and what our increasingly evident failures have been morally and societally. But I don't regret the decision. That is, this is the heart of it, and this is what Jewish moral reputation will come to be, and we will determine what it means to essentially call yourself Jewish for the foreseeable future, wherever this turns out.
Tell us about the organization ATZUM, how it came about, and basically what it focuses on today, and what your role is now.
ATZUM is an acronym for ATZUM-Justice Works. It's conveniently translates into that and is catchy. We decided that we would address the most urgent human needs that we felt were being under-addressed by Israeli public and private concern. Righteous rescuers who were being largely underattended, survivors of terror attack whose major wage earner and or child had been murdered or severely injured and who were not on the welfare rolls because they lacked the wherewithal to make the connections to benefit from the social programs available to them. Ethiopian 11th and 12th graders who had internalized some of Israel's abhorrent racist attitudes toward them, who were eager to disabuse of those feelings of inferiority. So we developed a video program for them in which they videotaped that's old language videotape. They made videos of their grandparents and parents walk from Ethiopia to Israel. And then we turned our attention to what is today our overriding concern, which is an attempt to drive prostitution and sex trafficking off the state of Israel, first by providing the legislation that will criminalize the purchase of sexual services and decriminalize and rehabilitate the provider, and secondly, a program of education for formerly prostituted people that enables them to get a bachelor's degree paid for by the public welfare system, which hopefully will lift them out of poverty and out of a dependency and out of the necessity of returning to the streets to support themselves and their children. ATZUM is, I'd like to put it this way, I think that I like to see even the full cups as less than half full, because it motivates you to want to make things better. But I think that I relentlessly think that humankind can, in spite of all the contrary evidence, can be led to better outcomes. I see just enough of that in my own lifetime, the treatment of women or the understanding of women's place in society, which is a long way from where it needs to be, but it's just wildly improved over the world in which I grew up. Particularly in orthoprax, I prefer to call it that than Orthodox Jewish life, where at least on the modern so-called end of that spectrum, there is completely new understanding of what women's role should be and might be. I worked for 17 years at what was the first halachically determined coeducational yeshiva Institute of Jewish Studies. That became a model for many other places, which has been replicated, fortunately. So I think that the moral of the story is expect the worst and never despair. Expecting the worst makes you hard-minded and makes you put in place the programs that will address the worst of it. And never despairing means that when a better day arrives, you're able to celebrate it rather than be dumbfounded by it.
So you founded ATZUM.
I founded ATZUM, right?
And what's your role there now?
I am the founding executive director who has been fortunate enough to consistently hire people smarter and more able than I am, who have achieved a tremendous amount, because I have, I'll say it, I think a rather rare executive understanding that the best thing to do with an able staff is to let them work and stay out of their way.
How many employees?
At the most, we had 8 people working for us. Today, there are 5 as a result of the war and its impact on our efforts, which is considerable. On average, there were 6, staff of 6.
And you live today in Caesarea, also known as Caesarea. And how long have you lived here?
For 10 years. After nearly 50 years in Yerushalayim, the contrasts are more than interesting. I'll risk this. It's extremely beautiful and extremely well maintained. You may not know this is the only place in the country that is not governed by a government authority. It's privately owned by the Rothschild Foundation. And so they clean the streets and they make sure that it looks like this. I don't know if you noticed, but that it's extremely well cared for. I wish I had their budget for flowers.
Is that why Netanyahu lives here?
He lives here because some people think that there's a lot of positive status to live in Caesarea.
You ever run into him on the street or in a
I
supermarket?
actually did once. I was walking on Yom Tov and he was jogging with his gorillas, and if he had made the mistake of stopping, I would have said a thing or two, but he made sure not to
What
stop.
might you have said to him, honestly?
I would have told him that megalomania is not a good foundation for governance of a Jewish state or any state. I would have told him that an attempt to save his tachas from criminal prosecution at the expense of the evisceration of the last guardian of real democracy in this country, the court system, is an extremely dangerous and unworthy inheritance to give the Jewish people.
And I knew your wife very well. I remember her so well. Such a wonderful, open-hearted, big-hearted person, Chaya. Both of you were very influential in my time in Missouri. and I understand that she died 3 years ago. And you have two daughters, yeah?
2 daughters and 2 grandchildren.
Can you just briefly tell us about them, please?
And my older daughter lives in Yerushalayim and is in charge of guest relations at one of the hotels in Yerushalayim. My younger daughter is a social worker who will do hopefully a master's degree starting next year in clinical social work, and in the meantime has been volunteering with groups of soldiers who have been in the army for months at a time and need debriefing psychologically and psychosocially when they come out of the army. My 2 grandchildren, one is currently in university and in a combat unit hunting terrorists nightly on the West Bank, and my granddaughter is a master's degree student in linguistics at Tel Aviv University.
All things considered, do you regret not pursuing the second base job with the Cleveland Indians?
No, but there are some things I regret. I think I should have gone on and done a doctorate and published something. I actually looked into it a number of years ago and was about to do it, and Chaya didn't want to spend the year. I would have had to spend an entire year in residence in Halifax, or at least in Nova Scotia, and she didn't want to tough out the winter. She said, "Oh, just do the studies and write the book and forget the formal enrollment." I'll just share this with you. When I was ordained, my father came up and hugged and kissed me and said, "Mazal tov." Nu, he said, "When do you start your doctorate?" I said that to the chairman of the committee that I was interviewing with to be considered for candidacy for a PhD. He said, "Why do you want to do this at your age? You'll be the oldest student we ever accepted." I said, "Well, the truth is I want to get the degree and put it in a gold frame between my parents' graves so they can finally rest in peace." He said to me, "I don't think I'd share that with the whole committee."
What's your guidance for people who are Jewish in the United States or around the world who are experiencing this resurgence of anti-Semitism? Should they consider making Aliyah, moving to Israel at this moment?
I'm not sure about that, but I am sure about this. The best way for Jews to deal with imminent danger or disaster is to look inward, not outward. That is, I wouldn't waste much time here blaming anti-Semites. I would look to strengthening the foundations of Jewish identity. The greatest failure of North American Jewish life is that in its non-Orthodox places, it did not develop a viable school system and educational format. The enormous failure of Reform and Conservative Judaism was that they wasted time on building synagogues where people don't believe what they're praying anyhow and increasingly rarely go, rather than developing a public school, Jewish public school system that could have allowed for free tuition funded by the many Jewish billionaires who are Reform and Conservative Jews. And that failure could prove catastrophic to the future of non-Orthodox Jewry in North America.
What do you see as the future of the Jewish state?
The first priority is to get different governance. This government is dangerous, regressive. I choose these words carefully and advisedly, and I actually think anti-Semitic. That is, when you have a government in charge of Jewish religious affairs that denigrates the identity of other Jews because of their systems of practice and belief, if non-Jews talk that way, we would have the ADL down their necks in 5 minutes. I think they are openly anti-Jewish in the profound sense of that word. This government needs to be voted out, and if it's not, if it's allowed to stay in power for the next 3 years, I'm not sure the state will survive. Or survive in a format that anybody would want to live in.
What are your, you look good, you look like you're in good health. What are your hopes and plans?
Goes to show how looks are deceiving.
What are your plans for the next couple of years personally?
I'm hoping to leave the active administration of ATZUM on the 31st of December of this year. There's somebody in place to take it over who I think will do a much better job. I'm hoping to develop a hobby, about a quarter of my time, maintain the 10 chavrutot hourly that I have weekly with chavrutot all over the world now. That's another quarter of my time, and I hope to take on a part-time volunteer job with some social care agency for about half the time.
Can you elaborate on that second one?
Yeah, I have 10 hours a week that I study with people between Jerusalem and Felton, California by Zoom, in which we study classic Jewish texts and ask the best questions we can of them. Since most of my chavrutos know more than I do and are smarter, for me it's a learning experience.
And you told me that when you were in Columbia, Missouri, you took it upon yourself to go, I think, to St. Louis once a week to learn with 3 rabbis whom you respected. Can you talk about that for a minute?
Yes, I was I think, poorly educated Reform rabbi. The Hebrew Union College, for its most serious students, of which I was not one, provided a barely adequate education and let everybody else through with a kind of contempt for the congregational. Well, I'll tell you the story and you'll decide whether to X this out. The first class I had in Talmud, the professor walked in, I'll give you the accent, he said, gentlemen and Sally Preston was the first ordained Reform rabbi who was in my class. He said, this is Talmud 101. My responsibility is to teach you all the Talmud you'll need to know to deal with your Reform congregants. He said, now I've done that. And and there were 6 of the 36 of us that continued to go to class.
What was his name?
I'd rather not cite, but anybody that was there will get it from the accent. And he was a well-regarded and well-known Jewish scholar, rescued from Nazi Germany by the Hebrew Union College to its great credit. And the 6 people who wanted to really take Talmud seriously continued to go to class, and some of us did politics and played basketball.
Okay, so the three people in St. Louis whom you actively sought out during the 70s when you were at the Hillel, running the Hillel in Columbia, Missouri.
They were Rabbi Jim Diamond and Rabbi Shapsai Wolf and Rabbi Simcha Kraus. I'll tell you what one of them said to me the first time we learned. I'd never met him before. We sat down and learned for an hour, and he said to me, can I ask you something? And I said, yeah, of course. He said, how can anybody as obviously smart as you are know so little? That's why I've shown up. I mean, I really mean this. I think that ignorance shouldn't be a foundation of shame. Ignorance should be something to be overcome, and I'm glad that I understood that, and I'm glad that I'll say it, that I had the wherewithal to understand that I needed much more to function as a Jew, and particularly as a rabbi, with greater integrity and greater impact and greater understanding.
Thank you.